Board of School Trustees for Monday, August the 8th, 2022 at 6 p.m. here at the Educational Services Center. I want to take a moment and welcome everybody who's joined us in person, along with anybody who might be joining us on our live YouTube stream. We're so happy that you're here and can join us. And tonight is an annual session where we go over the budget. So our first order of business is the adoption of the agenda. Board members, any changes? Administration?
No changes.
Then do I have a motion to adopt the agenda for the Monday, August the 8th, 2022 board budget work session as presented?
I so move.
All those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Oh, second? Yes, thank you. We'll recognize Mr. Chonwell with the timely second. All those in favor vote aye. Any opposed vote nay. Motion carries by a vote of 7-0. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Thacker for the presentation of the budget for year starting January 1st, 2023.
Thank you, President Riley, Board of Trustees, and welcome everyone. At this time, I would like to ask Executive Director of Business Services, Mr. Jerry Hawkins, to present the budget for the year beginning January 1st, 2023 and ending December 31st, 2023. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker, President Riley, and members of the board. This is the fun time of the year for me. Busy, but I love talking about numbers. So tonight we're going to talk about that. And we're going to go through our presentation. And of course, at any time, you can certainly ask questions. There are, it's very similar to a presentation given each year. A few added things, but basically the same presentation. So don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have a question. All right, we're here to talk about the budget. First of all, I want to acknowledge our business office. We have a phenomenal office, and it takes, the whole idea is I don't build this by myself. I'm just the one presenting. There are a lot of people. We have a lot of challenges, a lot of unknowns. We always have some unknowns. But of course, as we've seen with COVID, we have a lot more unknowns, it seems, even as its impact has diminished some. We've had a tremendous amount of help with Lisa Zachary, Vicki Roush, and Maureen Munger. They've all helped in building the budget in terms of putting information into the system and helping create some of the reports and things that are needed. Lisa's here. Vicki was here. I know she's upstairs. She's probably working away. She might be online. But anyway, I appreciate their help in all of this. Our objective is to maintain expenses within revenue streams provided. Our goal is to focus on programs and services for student achievement while providing competitive compensation packages for all employees. Purpose of the work session is to go through our 23 changes, review the budgets, and discuss the next steps. First of all, I want to note these are the 4 funds we're talking about. I know there's discussion about other like ESSER reporting and other things that really is not part of tonight's presentation. It will be coming. We're working on that. Tonight, we're talking about these 4 funds: the Education Fund, Operation Fund, Debt Service Fund, and Rainy Day Fund. These are the funds that are required to be part of the budget process. So that's the funds that we'll be talking about tonight. I put a picture of a money tree in there because it is always funny. A lot of people it's my joke. I say, well, I guess I got to plant another money tree out back because the number of requests that come in are frequently more than the available revenue that we have. And that's always the case. It's been the case for ever since I've been doing budgeting for 20 plus years. And it is just the nature of the beast. So if you ever hear me say I'm going to go plant another money tree, it's kind of meant tongue in cheek to say we have an unlimited funding source. And so we don't have a money tree out back as much as people might wish we did. I certainly do. All right, Education Fund. Let's talk about that. Education Fund is the biggest fund. It's where we pay the majority of people. Some assumptions. It is heavily driven by the ADM, our average daily membership. And we have to make some assumptions on what that's going to be. We don't know yet. We can make some guess, but we're going to make an assumption it's going to be fairly flat. And you'll see in the way I present, you'll see how that works. We have 2 student count days. Again, that was a change a few years back. Used to be you had 1 count day in the fall, and that determined your revenue for the entire fiscal period. Now we have 2. So we have 1 count day in the fall that funds basically July 1 to December, and we have 1 in February that funds January to June. Now, the difficult thing is our funding well, I'll come to that here in a minute. Other student counts, we're assuming they stay constant because there are a lot of different counts that determine our total funding from the state. And revenue from July to December would be constant. And that revenue is reflective on what account we're going to have next month. So we're, again, it's kind of that dart on a wall. You hope you know where the target is, or you hope you know where you're going to be, but you don't always know until finally have those children in the seats. And then also an assumption that we're going to have some salary enhancements. We continue to work at that and know that we're in a competitive world to get employees and to keep employees, and we want to attract and retain the best we can. And then, of course, health insurance is our biggest cost when it comes to benefits. We are likely to see a minimal increase. We're having a very good year in terms of the insurance, but we're also not funding at 100%. It's kind of a long story, but the bottom line is we're likely to see an increase in insurance. Hopefully it will not be very big. But again, that's an unknown at this point. We don't have the renewal back from insurance carrier yet to know what that might look like. Revenue. So here's a discussion about the revenue. It is a state funding formula. Now, the thing to remember is revenue is funded by fiscal year, meaning July to June. What I'm showing you tonight is a budget that's calendar year. I have to do a calendar year budget. So I have to make assumptions what we're going to do in calendar year 23 for what the legislators are going to decide this coming winter for that next biennium. So there's a lot of pieces that go together in making a budget. So I just want you to understand that it's a fiscal year revenue stream. I only know what revenue goes through June 30th of 23, assuming I know what my ADM is. So there's a lot of assumptions go. So here, let me explain a bit about the basic tuition. Basic tuition is the biggest funding source for the education fund, and it is made up of really complexity. I mean, the foundation, they call it, which is what everybody gets the same amount. Every school district in the state gets a foundation amount, which is $6,235. The virtual students are 85% of that. That's $5,299 per student. And then the complexity index. Now, the complexity index, they lump it together. You kind of got to decipher the information to figure out what the complexity index is for us. And for us, it's $301.25 per kit. The complexity component is the piece that varies between district and drastically changes the funding that a school can receive. Foundation stays the same, but complexity is variable. Question?
So that complexity amount is related to the percentage of students that we have on free and reduced price lunch? Is that how Indiana determines?
Almost. Yes and no. It is based on the direct certification number. So that's SNAP, TANF, and Foster, not free and reduced lunch. Now, those qualify for free and reduced lunch, but we also have those who submit applications, and those do not count in this funding.
I guess my question is, are we doing a good job of making sure, do people self-report?
They have to, we can encourage them to go report, but for direct certification, we have no say in that.
So it's the choice of the parent to,
Yes,
but it does impact our complexity.
drastically.
So are we doing a good job of communicating to parents the significance of the direct report, et cetera? We're doing all we can to make sure that our complexity grant is as accurate as it can be, and that we're capturing that money.
I would say we're doing the best I've ever seen a school district do. Is there more we could do? I don't know what that would be, but I would say we're doing what we can. If you called every person who filled out an application and encouraged them to do direct certification, there's maybe a few more things we could do. It would be difficult to accomplish that level without significant more staff. But I would say we do a very good job. It became much harder when lunches were free. So, when COVID hit and everybody got free lunches, it affected our free and reduced lunch applications probably more than direct certification did, because the direct certification numbers didn't vary as much. But we would anticipate this year that our applications for free and reduced lunch will go up because there's no longer free lunches for everyone. That'll also help us in our textbook rental work. But I'm not sure that will make a significant difference on the direct cert, because if they're SNAP and TANF, that's a different, that affects their world a lot different than just school lunches, because that's all the application does. So does that answer it? Okay. So you see in that first bullet point is the tuition support, basic tuition support, which covers the foundation and complexity. The next three are the other items like honors diploma that we get additional funding for, special education, and then of course, career and tech ed, the vocational school. And you'll see how that funding all works out. So it's a little hard to read, I know, from a distance, but this is now I want to caution you, first of all, the chart starts at 10,000. It makes the variation from year to year look more a larger difference. So I want to clarify that, but it was to try to make a point of the 2 count days or 2 count times. The red is the February, the blue is the fall, the September count. And you can see some years they're fairly close, some years they're wide apart. I think one was as much as 70 kids. In fact, 18, 19, you'll see there was a pretty big difference there. Last year, there was a bit of a difference. So again, we have to make those assumptions. We don't know what's going to happen next month with our kids. We know even less what's going to happen in February, but we have to build a budget based on some assumptions. And so we have to take into account that likely, historically, we've seen a drop in the spring compared to the fall in our ADM count. So that's the purpose of this chart. Questions on that? Yeah.
Quick question. I think I know the answer, but in the differential between the 2020 to 2021 school year versus the 2021 to 2022 school year, it looks like there's a drop of 291 students. But in actuality, I think it's a gain of about 10 students, but the state helped us by reclassifying students who go to night school where they couldn't be considered in the ADM anymore.
Correct. And I should have clarified that. And I mentioned it last year, and I think I mentioned it in other presentations, but that is exactly what happened. We lost slightly, I think it was 301. Does that sound right? I think it was 301 students that were attending our night school, that we were educating and working well with, that were over the age of 22, that basically a moment's notice, to me, it seemed like a fairly quick decision. We were no longer going to get that funding. So we lost about 301 kids, but the difference of 291 or whatever it is meant our regular enrollment outside of night school went up slightly, but our funding for those kids went down because of the students that we were unable to get funding for that were a part of our night school. Yes, I should.
Well, it's a follow-up question. Maybe it's not a tonight kind of question, but what are we doing for those adult students that now the state no longer classifies as eligible students? What are we doing for them to provide them with educational opportunities? And like I said, maybe it's not a tonight question, but.
Well, we felt committed to those students who had started the program, and we were going to work through them to kind of finish them, but we weren't going to enroll any new ones. There are some adult ed programs out there. The difficulty is, my experience with adult ed programs is they don't fund the expense. In other words, their funding is significantly less than what it costs you to run an adult ed program. Many schools have chosen not to run adult ed programs because of that. So the options are less because of the decision by the legislators. Okay. Next. So here's a funding formula. It kind of combines the 4 categories of funding, the primary funding source for the education fund under basic tuition, and you can see a comparison from year to year. And then you see honors, you see special ed, and you see career and tech ed. And you can kind of see what the estimate that I'm proposing we would be for the 22-23 school year. But again, I'm building a 23 budget. So the fall of 23 is not even in this chart anywhere, because I don't know what legislators plan to do for that funding period, because that'll be determined in this session. this upcoming session. So you'll see we're looking at approximately 2.9, almost 3 million increase, with the assumption that we're going to have exactly the same number of kids enrolled that we have now. Slight changes in special ed, slight changes in career and tech ed. There were some changes that are being considered, and special ed is based on dollar amount of the need of that child. So, each year, what child you have in different categories determine that funding. So we are seeing some increase in that, but along with it comes expenses in that program as well.
Question, because I've become a huge fan of the career and technical education at Penn through my own children. Is that a decrease because we're expecting less students to participate, or is it because the funding allotted to CTE courses you expect to go down?
It's kind of a change because the high school administration was reviewing the options that the students had. And we were requiring them to take a course that qualified as career and tech ed, but it limited the students in other ways that was more, I'll say painful, let's say, less flexible for the kids, because it took a class and required everyone to take that class. They felt like it hurt students more for the other options it gave them than the benefit of the class itself. So that changed the funding that we would receive, because they're no longer going to offer that class. The estimate was it was going to be about an $80,000 decrease in funding. That's what's represented up there. We don't know exactly what that impact is going to be in terms of what classes those students then end up taking. Is it a different career and tech ed that we do get some funding for? And those numbers, we tried to run the numbers and get an estimate, and that's the reason. I don't think it's any reflection on less students taking career and tech ed. It's just a shift in the classes that we're requiring students to take. That makes sense. Good question. I love questions. This is great. All right. Any other questions on this this sheet? One thing I don't think I mentioned, it was 2 sheets ago. The legislator did a tremendous job with funding for schools. They increased again this year, $240 for every student. That is significant. The funding that the legislators did for us this biennium that we're finishing up here was the best I've ever seen in school funding in terms of an increase. So I think kudos go to them for what they did for us. Now, is it enough from my seat? No, but it's a great step in the right direction. And so when you look at when you look at this slide, you'll see that's biggest reason why we see that increase. It's not because of an increase of students. It's primarily because of that funding. So important thing. All right. So here's something I show and have shown more than once. When you take a look and you throw that basic grant and you throw complexity in, here's the dollars that we would receive or have received in 2021 on a per student basis. I still don't have 21-22 data to update this chart, but I thought it was significant to recognize. Many people assume that PHM gets more money than any other school district, and that is just not the case. We get less per student than really any district around us, certainly any large size district. I didn't poll every school district in our area or in the state to know, but pretty clearly there's a major discrepancy when you're talking almost $1,000 a student difference from us to a neighboring school district. Now, do they have more needs? I would say, yeah, I think you could easily argue that. I'm not sure it's that much more need, but that's for them to argue. I just think it's clear to understand that we're not getting more funding than other school districts get. So here's a comparison of the budget, and the budget that I'm proposing is a $75 million budget. You'll see in 21, the budget was 70 million. We expended 67 million. We always spend less on our budget. We have to. We proposed a budget of 72 million last year, and then we're advertising a much higher budget. Now I'm going to say it here, and you'll probably hear me say it 4 or 5, maybe 10 times tonight. We advertise our budget high. We advertise our rate high. We advertise our levy high. We advertise our revenue low. Because of the restrictions that are placed upon us, we are asked to, by the state, the DLGF, Department of Local Government Finance, requests that we do that for a variety of reasons, but because there are so many unknowns. There can be so many things that can impact us that if we don't advertise high enough, we can put ourselves in a very difficult spot. So we are advertising a high budget. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to spend. And as you see in 21, we certainly spent less than our budget. And you see those reports every month of how we're doing compared to our budget. And you'll note that typically that's the norm of what we do. So this is our proposed budget that we are presenting. So that's the education fund. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll go to the operation fund. Now, if you remember a few years ago, the state changed to where part of the old general fund, most of it went to education, but some of it went to the operation fund. And then all of the other funds, which were capital projects, transportation, bus replacement, we have art and historical, are all now part of the operation fund. So we're going to talk about that next. In the operation fund, assumptions very similar, but the thing to note with this is funding source is very different. So same thing, salary enhancements. Again, we have difficulty attracting and retaining. I think we do a really good job, better than any school district around that I know of, but that doesn't mean there aren't still struggles. Health insurance, again, will impact this fund. Now I put this in there because it goes back to what I just said a little bit ago. The DLGF recommends that we advertise our budget, our rates and everything based on an assessed value of 95%. Now, one of the big discussions in our county, and actually around much of Indiana, certainly northern Indiana, is what assessed values have done for property owners. Well, assessed value is expected to grow, but yet we're recommended to advertise 95%. Well, if the actual goes up by 5%, that's a 10% swing in assessed value. That makes a big difference in what the rate is. So we are recommending we advertise a assessed value at 95% because that's what the state recommends we do. And then if it comes in where we expect it to be or very close to that, then that's where it directly impacts the tax rate that we anticipate to be very similar. And I'll go through the tax rate here in a little bit. Question?
May have a question for you, but
Okay.
You know what? I may have one too. I'm just going to ask it, even though it might reveal
Okay.
my lack of clarity here. The assessed value that you're referring to, is that the assessed value of all of our properties, capital, all of that? We're not talking about the assessed value of our district, but homeowners in our district. We're talking about our own, and
All-
this determines our rate.
All assessed value, all property in our school district that is taxed.
Got it. Thank you.
So that
That's
includes
what I needed
commercial and
clarification.
homeowners and
Yes. So it's not just the assessed value of PHM's property. It's within the district.
school
I
district.
think I understood what you said. Don't, yeah, let's not waste any more time on it. I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, come on. There we go. Tax cap impact. One of the things to note, and I'll have a slide on tax cap impact, but one of the things that makes a difference on that tax cap is, if you remember, residential pays up to 1%. The rentals and other things are 2%, and then commercial is 3%. What happens to individual taxpayers is it's an overlapping of different taxing units. So if you live in a taxing district where you live in a city and have city services, trash removal, not so much water and sewer because those are paid by monthly fees. But if you get a service, you got your libraries, you got township fees. And when you start overlapping those, that's when tax caps become more painful for us, and where the taxpayer is capped more quickly. Those who just live in the county and then a township and don't have high taxes, their ability to hit that tax cap is far less, or their times that they hit that tax cap does not happen near as often. So tax cap impact has continued to increase for us, and I'll show you a chart here in a little bit about that. Now, one thing that we are working from is we do know our max levy growth quotient. That's determined by the state on a formula, which that means that's the maximum our levy can grow to fund our operation fund. And that is set at 5%. So you'll see that I'm advertising a levy that's basically 5% above what it was last year, or what we were approved for last year, because that's the maximum we can do. I went slightly above because, rounding and other things can happen. I didn't want to limit us, but that will be a fixed number that the DLGF established and has established. Okay. So here is our information related to our revenue for the operation fund. And you can see the different categories of funding. Obviously, the biggest funding source is property tax. The 18,155,000 is slightly above 5%. I think it rounds to 5.001 or something like that. So it's right in that range of the maximum we can levy. License excise. One of the difficulties is sometimes in the past, those have not met our advertised amount. In other words, last year we advertised a lower amount and it was higher when a budget order was actually calculated. Great, we have a little more revenue than we were anticipating, but sometimes that's not the case. So if you look at commercial vehicle, it's not as big a number, but we advertised 87 million and actually only got 86. So again, I'm advertising a revenue that is a little lower than I think it might be, so that we don't run into a situation where we're not getting, or we're building a budget on revenue that we aren't getting. Let me say it that way. And then the rest of them are pretty standard things we've done in the past. Many of those are based on what we put in there, not what the DLGF says, because they don't know our specific situation on how much we receive on receipts from extracurricular, how much we receive on our investments, those kinds of things. So those are numbers that we put in on this budget. One part to note is the transfer from education to operation. One of the things that I'm very proud of is the fact that our transfer from the education fund to the operation fund, which is to cover those expenses that were moved from the general fund to the operation fund, that transfer is slightly less than 12%. Most schools are approaching the 15%, and some schools, even neighboring school districts, are over the 15%. I'm recommending that we hold the line on that transfer. What is happening in the operation fund, I track this very carefully. I look at it every month. And what's happened is the amount of money that is being transferred is not covering 100% of those costs. In fact, it's getting a little further behind every year. So normally I would say we should be increasing that transfer. But because of the fact that we have chosen to do, and our debt service allows us the capacity to borrow money for projects, we don't need to spend as much capital projects money out of the operation fund. That frees up a little bit more room to basically have that funding help fund, so we don't have to transfer as much money from education to operation. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense in my head. I don't always explain it the best, but the teacher in me certainly wants to explain it.
Just one quick question on that. Since you are finagling it just a little bit, so to speak, is that going to catch up with us down the road at all, or is that something that's just?
If we were ever in a position where we needed to turn around and expend a significant amount of dollars for capital projects or something else out of the operation fund, it would become a little more difficult. That number can be changed at any time for the next year. I mean, once we advertise that, we're kind of locked into that. We can do less than that. We can't do more than that once it's advertised. But I think we've got enough cushion and enough ability to work our way into it if something like that came about, because I'd also budget some emergency fund money if an emergency was to come as part of the operation fund. We typically don't spend that money, and it just is there every year to fund that in case something happens. So to your question, if it's an ongoing issue, we would need to readdress it on that next year's budget and begin to increase that. I don't believe it's a problem at this time.
Okay, good.
To follow up, so if you're starting to see that decay of, we're at 12% now, but probably could be at 13 or whatever number that is, how long until you feel like we can no longer hold that line at 12? Is that a projected 3-year, 4-year?
I think we can hold the line at around 11 or 12% for the foreseen future. I do not anticipate that will be a problem anytime in the next 5-7 years. I don't see a problem coming with this.
That's due at least in part to how you've managed the debt service.
Exactly, true. There's a lot of pieces in this. Thank you for that. And we'll be talking about debt service coming up. But yes, one of the things we've done, and if you remember, I think it was the last board meeting, we asked for additional appropriations because we wanted to pay debt off early. That saves us interest money out of debt service, frees up money where you have a shorter term on most of our debt. That frees it up to where if we had a lot of long-term debt, 20, 30 years or whatever, 20 years is usually the max. I don't know the actual legal term, but typically 20 years. We do ours less than that to free up so that we're not locked in. It's like a 30-year mortgage on your home. You're going to be paying that for 30 years, and then 10 years down the road, you refinance because you want to do something, you're back to 30 years again. You never really get caught up. By keeping it on a shorter term, 10, 12, 15 years, and having capacity in our debt service, that has allowed this to happen. And for the foreseeable future, we don't anticipate any problem with that. Because again, we have debt coming off. We're making significant first-year payments on our debt. So there's a lot of reasons why this is doable and why I'm recommending it. Good. Thank you. You guys are doing a great job of setting me
My
up.
guy I know has swag with numbers.
Well, I do enjoy them. If I can spend my day in a spreadsheet, I've had a good day. So here's the operation fund. You'll see the 21. The budget was 27 million. We expended 27.5, and then we spent just over 26 million. The budget for this current calendar year is 28,988, almost 29 million. And then I'm advertising 32. Again, we're advertising high. We can only get the budget that the growth quotient, the levy allows us to get, but we're advertising high to protect ourselves down the road. And in that 32 million is, like I said, the emergency fund and other things that we have there so that if something came up, we are covered. Because I think that's one of my jobs is to make sure that we're prepared for some of the unforeseen things. I didn't plan COVID. I didn't know it was coming. Maybe you guys did, but I didn't. But we were able to weather that storm, largely due to the many good decisions that you as a board have made over the years. So, any questions on that? Okay, now you can't see this one. It doesn't come through very well tonight with the lights, but basically this is what's called the capital improvements plan. And this is the plan basically for 3 years. So it's for 23, 24, and 25. What we anticipate spending of greater than $10,000 on projects and items. So over 3 years, I put in the miscellaneous building improvements would be somewhere around 780,000. Emergency allocation is 4.5 million. Now, that's 3 years total. You divide that by 3, you're looking at approximately 1.5 million a year because this I have to sum all 3 years. It's not 4.5 each year. It's a summation of 4.5. So this is what will be placed on our website and uploaded to Gateway because there are 3 things we have to do as we go forward that need to be done before the hearing, and I'll explain that hearing in a minute. One of them is the capital improvements plan. One of them is the bus replacement plan, and one of them is what's called Form 3, and I'll show you that here in a minute. Okay. I was going to set my phone on there to see what time it was, so I keep moving, but like a preacher, it doesn't mean anything when you when you take your watch off and look at it. So here's our bus replacement plan. I just touched on that. The uniqueness with this year's bus replacement plan is the fact that we have that potential electric bus grant. I have to list those buses here. I have to include, now what I did is we didn't include 100% of the bus cost of the buses because those electric buses are expensive, $425,000 or whatever. The assumption is we're going to get some grant money. If we don't get some grant money enough to cover it, we aren't going to buy the buses. But I have to put them in the bus replacement plan and have to put enough money in there for whatever would be our share if we got part of the grants, because we're applying for 3 different grants. We may get one of the grants that may fund a significant part of it, but won't fund it all. So year one, 23, of year one of this 5-year plan is a significantly higher, and we have the capabilities of doing that, provided that grant comes through. So that's why you see 22 buses. The original plan was 12 buses plus 10 electric buses gets us to that 22 number. If we get all 22, we won't need as many in 24, 25, 26, and 27. So that's why you see those numbers are less. If we don't get those electric buses and we only end up buying 12 or somewhere in between, 24 and on, we'll have to go back up a little bit potentially, because we need to replace the older buses that are failing or potential failing, I say that, or they're just costing more money to maintain than what newer buses do. That makes sense?
Yes, out of curiosity, what percentage of the purchase price of the electric buses do you expect the grant to fund?
What do I expect or what do I hope for? I'm hoping for 100%.
No, realistically, what do you expect?
I think it's very realistic. I think we could see 50 to 75%.
At 50%, do we go forward with the purchase? Is that the administration's recommendation?
Well, maybe what we would do is maybe not buy all 10, because the original bus is typically going to be 135,000 roughly. 50% of 430 is 215. That's still a lot more than we would have done just buying a regular diesel bus. So maybe we would come to you and say, we're going to do 5 instead of 10. That then equates to a similar dollar amount. This dollar amount that I'm putting on this plan is less than 50, that we would be funding less than 50%. I basically have it that we're funding approximately the same amount as we would be funding if we're doing a diesel bus, but getting electric. And then the ongoing costs of that electric bus are significantly less. So we're paying more out that year, but we're getting a much better return because of our cost of operating those buses are less.
And I asked this before, does that include the infrastructure to support those electric buses?
Yes.
Okay.
The infrastructure is part of the grant. So if
Okay.
there are multiple places we can get some infrastructure dollars. If we get the main grant that we're applying for, infrastructure is
Part of
in that application that we are submitting. Yep. Yeah, I would think, I mean, if we don't have a budget to do the infrastructure, it would be difficult to plan to buy 10 buses, because the infrastructure is absolutely crucial to do that. Good question. All right. I'm not going fast enough. I know I'm trying to hurry. All right. Debt service, next fund. As we explained, debt service, we're fortunate that we are in the position we're in with debt service. Here's the listing of the different components of debt service. We have general obligation bonds, which are decreasing. We have lease rental. We have common school loans, which have kind of pretty much been doing the same thing in our common school loans over the years. We went through a period where we actually, again, paid off a little earlier, saving some of that interest money. Bank and trustee fees just go with it when you're doing lease rental, pretty standard. And then textbook reimbursement, that's an estimate. I believe that's a high estimate, but that is determined by the number of the dollars that we did not get funded by the state for free and reduced lunch students who get free textbooks. I don't know if that makes sense, but we get some funding from the state. They don't pay 100% of it. Whatever's left that they don't cover, we get to include here. And that's what that number is. Okay, any questions on debt service? All right, rainy day fund. We have no expenditures budgeted at this time for the rainy day fund. Funding primarily comes from naming rights. Here's a little note, and I've said this, I think, before you at a different time. I believe our balance is well below what I recommend, and I think we should I would encourage us to consider a plan to begin to build that back up. Here again, you can't read this. Maybe on your screen you can see it. This is a scattering of. I went through and pulled out local districts and then pulled in some big districts similar to ours throughout the state. So it's a hodgepodge of both small districts and large districts. Pretty much any school within 2 or 3 counties around us is in here, and then some from larger districts. And what this is it's and it only goes through 2020. Again, that data is not readily available at this time. But what is their fund balance in their rainy day? Now, you could be a small district and have as much as we have, and that could be plenty. You could be a large district and have less, and it'd be a problem. So I did a per student basis, and I looked at it and said, okay, what do school districts have in their rainy day fund on a per student basis? Because that's a fair way to look at it. And you'll see we're third from the bottom on this report in terms of our rainy day fund balance on a per student basis. And I would argue, I think that's low. I think we should consider beginning to replenish that rainy day fund as we can. And if the board so chooses, I would bring a recommendation to you later in the fall that we would develop a plan on how we would replenish that fund. It's one of the advantage we have is our balances in our other funds are okay. So it's not a dire strait. If we didn't have fund balances in our other funds, then I would be even more concerned. But having a decent rainy day balance is that reserve that helps with some of the questions you've had is, can we handle this? What's the future look like? And it protects us in the future. Yeah.
So the operational transfer went down on a percentage, correct? The 0.5%.
Right.
So would it make sense to use that difference and start putting that in a rainy day?
We certainly could.
Flat on a percentage, and then
That would be one option. I will tell you, it's probably not a lot because we didn't drop the amount. Percentage went down, but the dollar amount stayed flat. Percentage wise, I think it might have dropped by 1%. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and I don't think it was that much.
I noticed a lot of school districts during COVID transferred millions from operation to their rainy day. Carmel, I think, was the recent with like 2 million.
And a lot of that with ESSER funds, they were able to save money on their operation costs because ESSER funds funded it. And we've seen some of that, but we're not using, most of our costs are not capital in nature when it comes to ESSER funds. So it didn't save us the same amount. I mean, we're spending it almost all on kids and the needs and all of those aspects of things that are in addition to what we normally do to try to catch kids up. So there isn't that level of savings in the operation fund that maybe some school districts may have experienced, but certainly would be an option to consider. I would have to run the numbers to see what that equates to, how much that is.
I guess just a question, and I appreciate this chart, but without knowing Wani, Maryville, New Prairie's balances in their ed fund or operations fund, it's a little bit of one-sided information where it looks like, oh, well, they have really big rainy day funds, but we could find out that they're depleting their ed fund and their ops fund every single year, and so they're not carrying any balances there. So it seems like if we knew that, we might be able to make, if we were presented with more information, because if we're carrying balances in those other funds, it seems like your rainy day fund is just in different funds.
That is true. And you're exactly right. This is only one piece of the puzzle. What they have in their other funds, I don't know. I will tell you, if you compare to 1E, their funding, I don't know what their education fund budget is, but they're not a very big district. They have 3,000 students. We have more than that in our high school. So to have $12.5 million in a rainy day fund.
I mean, it looks like they were putting 1.1 million in the rainy day fund every year.
They have, yes. And I don't know what's happened since then.
18, 19, and 20.
Correct. So, and that's one school. We don't want to make a decision about PHM based on one school. That doesn't make sense. But it is a comparison for us to say, we need to look at it. We need to say, is this something we feel that we should do? And I would argue, even without this comparison, and I would have said before I did this, that our fund balance is too low. Our rainy day fund balance is too low. When I did this, it's like, whoa, we are really too low comparative from that side of things. But your point is exactly right. This is only one piece of the puzzle, and we don't know all those other pieces or their reasons for making those decisions. They might be seeing some major clouds down the road that they need to prepare for. That's the reason. I don't know that. We don't know all those details.
And we know, based on the information that you've provided us just moments ago and over the previous years, that we are the lowest funded of any of our local schools, which means that their operating budget is significantly greater than ours, which speaks to how well you've done in terms of managing our operation fund. Let me ask you this question. Given the financial health of the school district, and knowing that you're a very cautious, very deliberate guy in terms of forecasting over the future, over what period of time would you like the board to consider adding to the rainy day fund, and what threshold amount would you like to achieve per student?
That's some tough questions there. Certainly would recommend it over a 4 or 5, 6 year time period. I would not, ideally, I would like us to see be around the 5 million range in rainy day. I am not as concerned that we get there right away as much as we have a plan to get there or get somewhere. If, the whole idea of what's going to happen with the economy, what's going on there is a concern. We're directly impacted very quickly when the economy, because of largely due to the high manufacturing RV industry that we're associated with, as well as other industries in our community. We get hit pretty quickly in that area. People start losing jobs, people stop spending money. A lot of things can happen. I think we are in very good shape, and I think if we have a plan to get toward a position where we've got, and 5 million is no magic number. We were at a little over 3 million. I think it was 3.2 million. And then we chose to pay some stipends out of that, which was fine, but we then we didn't have a plan to build it back up. And I would have said 3 million was too low for a district our size. If I was the size of a much smaller district, that's not a bad number. But considering we're bringing a budget to you that is expending $126 million, a rainy day fund of 1.7 is not anything to be proud of.
There were times in the recent past that we weren't in the luxury of having this consideration. Now that the financial health of the corporation is really strong, and with the grace of God, perhaps this pandemic is behind us and we don't have to worry about that financially any longer, it would be my suggestion that you come forward to the board with a proposal this fall for adding to the rainy day fund. This is not a session in which we are going to be taking votes, but if any board member were to disagree with me, by all means, please let your voice be heard. But I think it's prudent, and I think that we're in a position now that we haven't been where this is a realistic possibility.
Thank you. I agree.
Does it make sense to kind of project out that our rainy day fund might be a certain percentage of our overall budget? Like try to keep the rainy day fund at, like, say 7 or 8% of our budget. It's like 75 million. That would be about a $5 or $6 million rainy day fund. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Makes perfect sense. I would love to work with that gives us a target, that gives us a position that we want to be at. And with your direction, then we would develop that plan to be something like that. And then the question is a percent of your total budget that I'm presenting, or is it just the education fund, or what? I mean, it doesn't really matter necessarily what you're using, as long as the percentage is reasonable within that total, because there are different constraints on revenue streams for the different funds. And so you could do the whole and maybe do less than the 5 or 6%, or you could do just the education fund and be in that range. We will work on a plan and send you some information, and we'll work on that for this fall.
Thank you.
Now, does the state still give you guidelines of how much cash you're supposed to keep on hand at the end of the year? That used to be the way it was way before.
They
Rainy day fund.
they quit doing that mostly because they went above what they were many times recommending. So they didn't want to recommend anymore because I shouldn't say that. Because many times they were criticized for the amount that they had in reserve, because there were good things that money should have gone for, in some people's opinion. I'm not trying to make my opinion or anybody else's heard, but that was one of the things that occurred over the last several years. And just like what they just recently passed with some of the funding and some of the things they're doing, they're spending down their rainy day fund. And I haven't done any numbers to know what percent they're at or different things like that. But they do not, to my knowledge, have not submitted anything to us that says this is what we recommend you have in balances in your funds or in your rainy day fund or any of that.
Well, it used to come from the Indiana School Board.
Well, and I've not seen it. If they have sent anything out,
They do it anymore.
okay, yeah, I've not seen it in many years. So, well, many, at least in the last 5 or 6 years. Seems like many sometimes. Great discussion, but I'm not going to meet my deadline if I don't keep going. All right, here's our assessed value. Basically, it shows what's occurred in our assessed value. And if you remember back, I guess one thing to note is if you remember in 2008, the recession that occurred, you'll notice we were still dropping our assessed value in 14. That was 6 years after the fact. When a recession hits, the assessed values come much later in that process and even after recovery has occurred. So just, I guess that's something to keep in mind. Revenue from the state is affected more quickly than revenue from the property taxes. So I have in here an estimate of 5%. I don't know for sure. We've had some indications that experts are suggesting the county is going to be close to 5%, and we might actually be slightly above that. But we won't know. The deadline was August 1st. As of the last I checked on the status, we have nothing yet. Not surprised. I don't think any county in the state had it done by August 1st. So it's a very long and tedious process that they have to go through and work with the DLGF, get approvals and all these things that have to occur. We're hoping within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll have some answers on what the assessed value is, but we have to assume moving forward what we're going to assume is 95%, as I said before, to protect us because of the unknowns. Here's the same information just in a graph there that shows you what assessed value has done, and you can see pretty nice increases since 2014. Tax cap impact, I already touched on that a little bit, and the overlapping, I wanted to make sure that you understood that. So history to date says we have lost $22 million in tax caps. And basically that means we built budgets over the years that included that, but we didn't receive the revenue. And that's why it's crucial that we underspend our budget. Now they have a mechanism now that we actually take into account what that, they kind of subtract that off beforehand so that our budget is already reduced based on what we anticipate tax caps are going to be. We're anticipating, I'm suggesting it's going to be somewhere around $3.1 million loss. And that's a combination of both debt service and operation fund. I will tell you the DLGF has given us a number of closer to 3.7 million. I will also tell you they have been high, significantly high every year. So it's not what I would consider a reliable estimate. We have our financial advisor also works with the county, his team does, and we have some pretty good resources for getting what we think is probably a more reasonable estimate. So that's what we anticipate that we will be losing in this calendar year. All right, now this one's a little, color doesn't make it as easy to read as I would like. But basically, this does tax collections for all funds. So it says, okay, property taxes. We have a levy out there that says we are supposed to collect X dollars. How much did we actually collect? And in 17, we had a levy or a budget order, which includes that levy, was 23,800,000. We collected 22,600, so we collected about 95%. We don't know for certain of that 5% we didn't collect, how much of that is based on tax caps and how much of it is people, delayed in paying their taxes. It could be a variety of, I'm sure it's a combination. We assume the majority of that is tax caps. In 18, same thing, you all the way across. In 21, actually 20 was a drop because we only collected 91% of our anticipated revenue. So that was 2.1 million. Last year, when percentage-wise went up a little bit, our reduction was 1.8 million. And then now 22, it's not 13 million, but what that is year to date. So you understand that we've only collected the first payment of those property taxes, and 55% is in the range of where we usually end up at this time. So that shows you a little bit of that. Here's the same, basically same information, budget order versus tax collection, kind of shows it in a chart. I love charts like this because you can glance at it and see what's going on. Kind of goes back to the numbers thing. Here's tax rate. So if you remember back prior to 19, we had multiple funds making up what was a total tax rate of our school district. In 2016, our tax rate was $1.03, and it's gone down and then hovered around that 92, 93 cent range most years. 22 was 93.87. So that's per 100 of assessed value. We only have two things that make that number up anymore, and that's operation fund and debt service fund. So in a couple years, those colorful bars on the left side will go away, and you'll just have two bars that make up that number. Tax rates. So if you remember the other chart I showed you, we are one of the lowest in funding for the state funding that affects education fund. Here's our funding that affects our operation and debt service fund. And as you can see, we're second from the lowest. We've been the lowest until Elkhart's referendum didn't pass, and then their tax rate went down. So we're slightly above theirs, but these are the same schools that I showed in that other chart with the funding. As you can see, we have one of the lowest tax rates in the area. Pretty much, I'm not certain on New Prairie, but I know the top three schools all have referendums in place currently, and that's one of the reasons their tax rate is high.
Prairie's got referendum.
Okay, so all four of those ones above us, in terms of their tax rate, all have referendums, and that's the reason. And you got to remember, referendum is a big deal because that's above tax caps, which means they're collecting a larger percentage of that than those who are not, because a referendum means it's not affected by tax caps. It's up above that. So that homeowner might be capped at 1% for everything except the referendum. Referendum's added on top. And so of that, let's say Concord, $1.56 per 100, they're collecting a higher percentage of that maybe than we might be because of the referendum. So another piece.
Referendum's like, is that forever, or is that like a certain time period?
It's currently 8 years. So referendum passes, and that's what happened to Elkhart. I think when they passed it the first time, it was 7 years. Now they've changed it to 8 years. And so they were going out for a renewal, and it didn't pass for that renewal after those 7 years. Okay, summary. So here's a budget. So we've got multiple components. We're talking about budget, and that's what we have in front of you here is the 21 budget, the 22 budget, and then what we're advertising for the 23 budget. And remember, it's high budget because we advertise high. And you can see the comparison of year over year. Then we go to levy. So this is the amount of dollars that are collected based on property taxes. And you can see where we're at there. And I will tell you the debt service advertised levy will not be that high. But because we're using a 95%, it ups that levy and it also ups the rate. Well, we up the levy. I shouldn't say that. I misspoke. The levy is based on the need that we're showing in advertising. If you remember, we've got on the books, we're going to be bringing to you additional steps in the future for our lease that we're doing. We delayed the selling of those bonds until we know the assessed value, so we have the ability to control the tax rate. So this is, again, advertising way high simply to protect us, because if assessed value goes up, we want to maintain that tax rate in the range that you want it to be. We have the ability to do that by waiting until after assessed values are determined. And then the operation levy is that 5%. And then here's the rate. And again, you're looking at the actual rates versus the advertised rates. And I'll show you on the next chart why this is a bit deceptive. We're advertising a $1.18 rate. There's no way I'm going to stand before you and recommend we have a $1.18 tax rate. I would not do that. But because of advertising, and I guess I shouldn't say that. I have no belief that we're going to be anywhere close to $1.18 in tax rate. But we need to advertise it to protect ourselves in case some unforeseen situation occurs. Here shows you a little better picture. If you look at 21, the advertised rate in debt service was 61 cents. We only had a 37, almost 38 cent tax rate. And you look at operation, we advertised as 71 cent and we only had a 54 cent. So the total tax rate in 21 was advertised at $1.33. We only had a 92 cent tax rate. Last year, we advertised a little lower tax rate. And it's recommended that we advertise higher. So that's why we're actually up a little bit from that. But again, you'll see $1.17 was the advertised tax rate last year. We only had a 93 cent actual rate when all the budget was calculated by the Department of Local Government Finance. This year, we're advertising $1.18, still lower than we did 2 years ago, slightly up from what we did last year. So that's an important slide to recognize the fact that you're not necessarily approving $1.18 for our budget. You're just approving us to advertise that in our budget. I knew you'd get tired of hearing that by the time I got done. Here's our Form 3. This is another piece that has to be advertised, and this kind of culminates all the information I just gave you and puts it in, and it gets uploaded into Gateway, and then it's available to the public. It also gets posted on our website. It's minimal in its helpful information, but it is what's required. All right, next steps. I'm almost done. Publish Form 3 and both the bus replacement and the capital improvements plans on Gateway and on our website. Conduct a public hearing. So in 2 weeks, we will be coming to you to have a public hearing on our budget. And then the following board meeting, we would ask for adoption of that budget. And then we would submit all of the paperwork that goes with that, and then hope to see a budget approval from the DLGF sometime in November, December. We got it in December last year. It's the earliest it's been in many years. November is wishful thinking, but the sooner we have it, the easier it makes it for the transition to the new calendar year. Questions?
Question with the rate. So with the advertised rate of $1.18, obviously that's the advertised portion. We'd expect the actual to go down, but you had walked through that on the assessed value. We're only recommended by the state to do 95%. Is that 95% of last year?
Correct.
So it's 95% of last year, and we fully anticipate, based on what we're hearing, that it'll go up 5%.
Correct.
This year.
Correct. So that's a
So-
10% swing.
Right. So in actuality, our tax rate that we will actually collect, that will actually go into effect, is very realistically below last year's 93.87 based on assessed value trends.
I think that's a goal that's determined what does the board want to see in that tax rate. I would say, I would expect the tax rate to be very close to what it is currently. That's what I would anticipate based on the budget that you're seeing here and what we can propose. Again, it can be determined largely due to what we do with our lease that's coming due, or that's coming up to be sold. So one of the things that happens is, how quick do we want to repay that? We're not locked into that yet. What is our first year payments going to look like? The first year payments, we have planned that we're going to make a first year payment of $6 million. Well, we can adjust that if the assessed value changes. We can't go more than, I forget, it's slightly over 6 million. We can't go more than that, but we could go less than that to then maintain that rate where we need it to be. So if the board says, I want the tax rate to be X, we can get very close to that. I mean, it's hard to get exact because there's other factors that could change it by hundredths of a penny, but we can get very close to that because of the fact that we're delaying that lease. Does that make sense?
Okay, other board members, questions and comments? Well, Mr. Hawkins, I can't adequately express my appreciation for you. I have always appreciated your very deliberate, very cautious approach to budgeting. I don't know if the other board members know this, but on an semi-annual basis, Mr. Hawkins and I get to sit down with a team of examiners from the DLGF who give us an extremely thorough exam on everything that Mr. Hawkins does. And I can tell you, it gives me a lot of pride to be able to convey to you the confidence that the folks from DLGF have in Mr. Hawkins. And so thank you so much for everything you're doing. Don't go far. We're going to see you a little bit later this evening.
Yep.
Board members, I think that concludes our budget work session. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Any opposed vote nay. That concludes our budget work session, and we're adjourned at 7:09 p.m.